I'm Sophie Coe, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we speak about the resurgence in Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, what it's like reporting from the Donetsk region, and hear how one of our reporters rescued a dog from the war zone.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 19th of May, day 85, and today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Nicholls, our Defence Correspondent, Danielle Sheridan, and our Senior Foreign Correspondent, Roland Oliphant, who's currently out in Ukraine. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Yeah, hi Sophie, hi everybody. It's been 24 hours of small tactical actions in the Donbass. There have been reports of very, very minor Russian gains and equally small Ukrainian counterattacks pushing back in a number of areas. So not a lot has changed in the Donbass. Just on the Azovstal steel plant, this is information from Russia's defense ministry. But I think we could take the numbers here. I don't think these would be widely disputed. They're saying that in the last 24 hours, another 771 Ukrainian fighters have surrendered, taking the total to 1,730 since Monday. That includes 80 wounded. The International Committee of the Red Cross have also put out a statement to say they are registering the prisoners of war in both locations. The ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, as listeners may remember, this is the international organisation related to, but subtly separate from the individual country Red Crosses. The ICRC is a massive organisation. It's there to look after wounded and those who are no longer able to participate in conflict. They have the right under the Geneva Conventions. They have the right to access all prisoners of war and interview them without anyone else being in the room. And they are that means of making sure that the prisoners and people who are no longer participants in combat and conflict are looked after and treated humanely. So interesting that the ICRC, as we mentioned yesterday, actually, ICRC very quickly giving an update, which didn't say a huge amount, but just letting us know and letting Russia know that they've got their finger on the pulse there. And the only other thing that we should note is a report out of Russia again. This comes from the governor of Kursk region, saying that there was an attack in the early hours of this morning in a village called Chikino, which is down on the border, on the Russian side of the border with Ukraine. There was a shelling, an assault there, which he says just destroyed an alcohol factory. But he says that the shelling came from Ukraine and killed a civilian. I mean, we've got no independent verification of that, but interesting and unsurprising, I suppose, that Russia will amplify any reports that suggest there's Ukrainian military attacks over the border, especially if there are civilian deaths. I'll just take a pause there.
Thanks, Dom. I was also reading today on our website that Putin is purging his top generals after their failures in Kharkiv. Obviously, this presents a counter-narrative to the kind of statements that were coming out of the Russian ministry this morning. What do you make of these reports, and why would we see Putin purging these generals?
Well, Russia historically, and the Soviet Union before it, had a long history of taking people out of command very early if they were shown not to be performing. I mean, all militaries do this. That in itself is nothing surprising. You don't want people in command, excuse me, who have been over promoted or over appointed. So they've got a long history of doing this. Russia does historically take these people out of command much earlier than you might expect from a Western army. I mean, they have very little opportunity. They're expected to produce successes very, very early on in their tenure, which is slightly different to the way we do things over here. But we did see a few weeks ago, General Valery Gerasimov, that's the head of Russia's armed forces, went down into the Donbass. Initially, it was questioned whether or not he was taking command. I think that was always a little bit overblown, but it was assessed that he was down there to sort of shake the big stick and start getting things moving again. that coincided, or it came just a few days after General Alexander Dvornikov was put in overall command of the Ukrainian theatre following a number of losses. But today's defence intelligence assessment from Britain's MOD says that Russian commanders, and this is a quote, they're increasingly distracted by efforts to avoid personal culpability for operational setbacks. End of quote. That's them saying that in this very rigid command and control system that Russia have, there is so little forgiveness, or so little room given for mistakes, that what it does is it stymies initiative, and it means that people don't want to take decisions if all they're going to do is come a cropper if it goes wrong. So what that does is it encourages commanders at every level to push any critical decisions, or any decisions at all, back up the chain, and that just slows everything down. And as the Defence Intelligence Assessment says, Russia are, again, another quote, they're struggling to regain the initiative under these conditions. So it just slows everything down. And that might be what we're seeing in the Donbass. It's tough fighting there anyway. They're up against the 40,000-ish, 10 brigades worth of Ukraine's best troops, best trained, best equipped troops. And of course, they've been in those positions for 8 years. They are very heavily fortified positions. So it's an anvil that they're smashing themselves against, hence making these very small gains. And commanders just unwilling to take the risk of trying to do something that then may see them removed from command. So just everything's slowing down, which largely comes back to this really over-centralised command and control system that Russia runs throughout its armed forces.
Thanks, Dom. I was wondering, Roland, if I could bring you in here. Now, you have been, over the past few days, reporting on the situation in Kharkiv, which was one of the failures that has been cited to do with this purge of Russian generals. What's your take on how the resurgence of the city is viewed?
I mean, Kharkiv is interesting. It was a battle that began on the very first night of the war. The Battle of Kharkiv began, rather like Mariupol, and it dragged on and on. And the Ukrainians have, I think, it's quite significant because it is shaping up to be the second major victory for the Ukrainians in this war. The first, of course, was when the Russians basically gave up on their assault on Kiev, said, we're just not going to manage this, and went home. That was the first major success. And the second one is there in Kharkiv, where the Russians that they quite early on gave up on the attempt to encircle the city and were kind of sitting there bombarding it. But what's interesting about it is that this is a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, a genuine kind of Ukrainian attack. And the way they've succeeded, I think, is basically by doing everything the Russians didn't do. So they waited for a moment when the Russians were distracted. Most of their troops were dedicated to this Donbass attack. They took the time to concentrate their forces, achieve superiority in men, in armor, and artillery. And they had very, very limited achievable objectives, whereas the Russians tried to attack the whole country. And we know how that ended up. Around Kharkiv, the Ukrainians basically did two things. They went straight north from the city towards the border, which is only about 20, 30 kilometers away. And they went straight east towards the Severny Donetsk River, which is a kind of natural barrier. And if you can reach that, you can kind of use that as a hinge against which to set up your defense. And it worked brilliantly. But, I sometimes see this narrative that it sounds like it's been a lightning strike or something. It's really been a grueling fight there. I mean, it took them about 2 weeks to cover about a dozen miles to the north, something under 20 miles eastwards. The Russians didn't just run away. I mean, it's a fighting retreat. I was last in Kharkiv just a couple of days ago. You can still hear the shelling. And in these liberated villages just outside the ring road, there is artillery fire coming in. People were killed just a few days ago. I entered a liberated village just across the ring road, right next to Kharkiv itself, just a week ago. And we quickly had to leave because of incoming fire. So Kharkiv is a major, significant achievement for the Ukrainians. It's another blow to Vladimir Putin's ambitions. He's not going to get Ukraine's second city, its most important Russian-speaking city. But it's not over. I'm a little bit leery of these proclamations that the Battle of Kharkiv is over. There is still fighting going on there.
Thanks very much, Roland. I think, Dom, you had a question for Roland as well.
Yeah, if I may, Roland, great to hear from you, mate. Hope it's all going well for you out there. Please stay safe. You mentioned that it's a grueling fight up the north, and we've not tried to underplay it here at all. So I think that's absolutely the appropriate word. Throughout this war, Ukraine seems to be much more self-aware than the Russian military has been. So do you detect any, or rather, let me go back a step. So if they are that self-aware, I would imagine they'd need some period now of rest and reconstitution to re-equip the vehicles, ammunition, petrol, lubricants, etc., and to rest the fighters. Do you detect that there is that self-awareness there, or is there a sort of blood rush and they want to head east and try and cut off those supply lines down into the south?
I have not detected that blood rush. I mean, that blood rush exists, interestingly, on social media, and it's conversations that people have between themselves. You know, this discussion about, should we go for Belgorod? Should we do it? Should we go across the border? You know, what the hell? You know, and you know, amongst rank and file and ordinary Ukrainians, and this is a below the radar thing, right? This is not a conversation you'll have with Ukrainian officials, but kind of barroom talk about, you know, yeah, there's a thirst for revenge. Yeah, there's a thirst to go into Russian territory. Yeah, let's go for Belgorod. I really don't think that's going to happen. I think the kind of atmosphere is one of serious, growing confidence. You can almost cut the air of confidence. It's like butter. I mean, it's thick in the air. But at the same time, a real wariness about jinxing this. So I would suspect, as long as they don't get carried away, they will do exactly what you said. And as we said, kind of the success around Kharkiv was down to doing all those things the Russians didn't do, right? Making sure you know what you're doing, limited achievable objectives, taking the time to make sure that you've got that localized superiority. So that's my sense. Things can change, right? I'm not privy to the discussions inside the Ukrainian General Staff, but my sense is that they are being fairly sober about this.
Yeah, fair enough. And what about the news from Mariupol and the Azovstal plant? We've discussed this a number of times on the pod and said how the symbology of it will matter hugely to Ukraine, and matter more than any loss of territory and any triumph Russia might try and gain by saying that they've now taken the entire city. How is the events in Azovstal and Mariupol more broadly going down in the north of or northeast of the country?
It's a blow. I think it's a blow because, of course, you know, the Azovstal defenders had said, you know, surrender is no option, but everybody could see where that was going, and everybody knew that, you know, relief was not really an option. People were braced for the bad news, and I think braced for the defeat, and it's taken much longer to get to this point than anyone expected. It may have been that people were getting to the point where, wow, I mean, maybe they can hold out forever. This is amazing. So I don't really think that the fall of Mariupol is going to be a devastating blow to Ukrainian morale. And I think, you know, the spin doctors can easily spin this as a heroic last stand, you know, a kind of, you know, the way Britain turned Dunkirk into this fabulous myth. I don't really think that is going to be a catastrophic issue. But you can see from the messaging how concerned they are about it. You notice the Ukrainians were insisting on not calling it a surrender. They were saying it's an evacuation or a special operation to bring the guys home. Well, I mean, they're prisoners, and there's now talk of Russia, you know, stripping them of their rights as prisoners of war and putting them on trial and possibly executing them as Nazis. So that is an attempt to spin things. But I don't think it's going to be the mortal moral blow that perhaps the Russians hope to Ukrainian morale.
Sure, thank you. And from the sort of grand strategic down to the sub tactical, how are you getting on? You wrote a really interesting thing a few days ago in the Telegraph Dispatches newsletter, Dispatches from Ukraine newsletter, which is out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And you were talking about the fuel, how fuel is dominating your life, and the fuel shortages and the difficulty of finding it is consuming the early part of your day. I mean, how is that still the case? And how are you getting around? And where are you staying? What are you eating? What is your sort of daily routine?
I mean, right now I've sent a fixer and my photographer to go and get petrol. That's how I'm dealing with it now while I speak to you guys. Every day, it's a really, really serious problem. And in fact, so when did I enter Ukraine this time? On a couple of weeks ago, May the 6th or 5th or 7th. I crossed the border and I stopped to pick up petrol somewhere in Western Ukraine and turned on my podcast, and there were you guys speaking literally about the fuel crisis, and I just paid more than double. I mean, kind of more than UK prices to fill up a tank of petrol because I didn't have much choice. It's really, really difficult, and it's really having an impact on civilians, ordinary civilians. Military, police, ambulances, critical infrastructure are prioritized, and you can show up at a petrol station. But for ordinary people like me who aren't able to gain access to kind of these very precious petrol coupons, it's a matter of kind of checking an app in the morning and working out is there a petrol station where you can go without needing the special card or the special coupons, and when you get there, will they give you 15 litres or more than 15 litres? So yeah, it's a headache. And there's a massive headache in this job because, we're trying to cover vast distances every day.
And Roland, on travelling around Ukraine, I wondered how your experience returning to Ukraine, bearing in mind for listeners that don't know that Roland was there right at the beginning of the invasion, how it's differed this time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I arrived in Ukraine last time, several weeks before the war. So I just flew into Kiev like I usually do and took a taxi to the hotel and fine. And of course, now the airspace is closed. So this time I flew to Budapest, I picked up a hire car and I drove myself to Kiev. So that was a 3-day journey just to get in theatre to start reporting. So, one day to a neighbouring country, one day to cross the border, another day to cross most of Ukraine to Kiev. So that's one major issue. And as soon as you get in, you realise that fuel crisis, which was already starting back in the early days of the war, has got much, much worse. Other aspects, when the war began, those first few weeks, they were really, really fearful times. Real panic. No one knew what was going to happen. Lots of people expected Ukraine to collapse. We expected a kind of Battle of France scenario, or American invasion of Iraq, kind of Russian columns streaking across the country. We were terrified of being surrounded. When they stormed into Kharkiv on, I think, day 2 or 3, we thought for a few hours that we were in a city that was now controlled by the Russians. We were constantly trying to escape, encirclements that might or might not have that never emerged. Yeah, there was a sense of real fear and real things hanging in the balance. And I must say, you don't want to say the war is less scary, but it's definitely settled down. It's more static. The front lines aren't moving around that much, and that initial confusion, that initial fear has kind of died away, which makes it, for one thing, it makes it much kind of safer and easier moving around the roads inside Ukraine, because you're less likely to be accosted by a very nervous man looking for Russian paratroopers or something like that. So people have calmed down. It also makes access a little bit more difficult. The Ukrainian army has got a grip on its media policy, and kind of just running around, hairing up to the front and doing some reporting is not as feasible as it was before. So those are my initial thoughts about it.
And you've been in the Donetsk region, I believe. I was reading your report today from Slavyansk, which kind of touches on the changing sentiments in that region. Now, I know you say that has been almost closed to Western journalists for years now. What was your experience like there? And can you tell us more about the people that you met there?
I was here in 2014 when this all began, really. There was a revolution in Kiev, and then there was the annexation of Crimea, and then a couple of months after that, there was this counter-revolution in Russian-speaking parts of eastern Ukraine, which we now know was clearly curated by the Russian secret services from Moscow. They succeeded in creating a couple of so-called self-proclaimed separatist republics, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, and they managed to put a veneer on it. And you know what they did achieve? They did manage to find some kind of public support. They couldn't have done it without it. So there is this narrative that it was entirely the Russian special services, and there was no constituency for this kind of thing. Well, the Russians couldn't have done it if there wasn't a constituency for that. And back at the beginning in 2014, you could cross the lines quite easily. It was a very, very strange, weird war where you could interview some separatist fighters in the morning and then cross the lines and interview some Ukrainians in the afternoon, and then you could go back and have a pizza in the hotel in the evening. In terms of the people I found there, I mean, the Donbass region, it's heavily industrialized. It's a place where life, I think, has always been quite hard. And I think that's one reason the Russians managed to get this crazy insurgency off the ground here in the first place, because it's a place where I wouldn't say life is cheap for people, but where death is never that far away. Conversations with kind of separatist fighters about how, this might be terrible, but how many of my mates have died down the mines, this kind of thing. It's a tough place. It's a poor place. It's a place that felt like it was left behind for many years. And it's a place where there was an awful lot of nostalgia for the old Soviet Union. And I think there were two elements to the uprising that the Russians capitalized on to establish these republics that are seldom, one is like, a lot of people were nostalgic for the Soviet Union. They saw Russia as a successor state. So it wasn't so much pro-Russian as kind of nostalgia. Can't we go back to the way things were when we had some status as the workers and all of this Soviet nostalgia. And the other part of that is I think there was a bit of a working class uprising going on here. And if you look at the kind of the dynamics within the separatist rebel movement, there were people. There was a guy, I think it was Mozgovoy. He was one of the rebel warlords who showed up and set stuff up. I mean, he ended up being murdered in this kind of purge that the Russians carried out amongst the separatists to keep them in line. But he had these kind of quite radical kind of leftist ideas going on at the same time as this nationalist, expansionist kind of thing didn't really fit with what the Kremlin wanted. So that's one underlying part of life in the Donbass. And the other thing is, of course, everyone talks about being Russian speaking. It is predominantly Russian speaking. People speak Russian. It doesn't necessarily denote your loyalties. You can perfectly well be a native Russian speaker who is Ukrainian, and the Russian narrative that anyone who speaks Russian is therefore Russian, who's come up against that reality. But it's much more complex than that, because a lot of the Russian speakers came down in the 19th century during the Soviet Union to work in the industrial cities. The countryside around here, you've still got villages where people are speaking their dialects of Ukrainian. You have a lot of Greeks here because Catherine the Great settled Tatar Greeks from the Ottoman Empire here in the 18th century. So there's actually scattered around the Donbass an incredible variety of different peoples. And I could drone on at length about the Donbass because I've spent so much time here, but I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Roland. Just one more question on that. You were speaking about loyalties, and your dispatch, which is in the paper today, talks about those who have, I guess, switched sides in the war and moved from supporting the Russians or separatists to supporting the Ukrainians. Can you tell us more about those fighters that you met and why they switched sides?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I actually met someone who specifically switched sides. That might have been a case of a headline appearing I didn't write myself. But the point is, like, in 2014, I attended a funeral in Slavyansk, and there were three guys who had signed up with the separatists who'd taken over the town, and they were killed in a shootout, a fairly mysterious shootout, allegedly with Ukrainian militants, and no one ever got to the bottom of what actually happened. But there was a funeral, and they were marched through the town, and there was an honor guard with their shotguns, local guys who fired over their graves, and so on, and provided a bit of propaganda for the separatist cause. Yesterday, I was at another funeral of another Slavyansk native in Slavyansk. He was a sergeant in the Ukrainian army. He was killed near here by a Russian grad strike. And again, guard of honor firing over the grave. Words from the priest about how he died for a free and independent Ukraine. Another Russian speaker from the same town. What's changed? And people say two things have changed, really. One is that obviously when the Ukrainians recaptured this town in 2014, lots of those who were sympathetic fled and went down to Donetsk, which the Russians still control. And since then, that process has continued. The other thing is, if you did have kind of pro-Russian sympathies, it's going to be difficult to find them in the current, to speak freely about that in the current situation, just as when the separatist militia controlled this town, the Russians controlled this town, it's difficult to find sensible people willing to openly talk about supporting Ukraine. It's just, you keep your mouth shut. There's another thing. I mean, the father of the soldier who was killed told me that, look, Donetsk has proved what it is like, this Russian world. And Donetsk, again, I've been banned from there for a long time by the local separatist authorities, who are ultimately controlled by the FSB. But I mean, it's they've had a curfew in place ever since 2014, so you can't walk around the streets. About half the people have disappeared. People who live there describe it as a ghost town. This was a thriving, massive industrial city. They have a security service called the Ministry of State Security, which is named after one of the iterations of the KGB in the mid 20th century, who arrest people and disappear them, put them in prisons for interrogation. The last time I managed to do some reporting there. I mean, I was slightly in shock. I mean, it was kind of, you'd meet someone in a cafe and say, okay, let's move now. I don't like the look of those people who've sat down next to us, looking over your shoulder, being very unsure about being overheard, all this kind of thing, like a real atmosphere of fear. And I think there is a genuine sense in which, people who have their eyes open and are aware of that are very reluctant to sign up for this project, this so-called project of the Russian world. But I just want to add one thing to that, which is that one of the last guys I spoke to yesterday was one of these older blokes, who probably had some sympathy for Soviet nostalgia and so on. And he spoke to me about what's going on, and it feels like 2014 is coming back. You can hear the artillery duels in the background again. He said it's going to be worse than last time. I know the war's coming back. All of this. And then we asked if we could photograph him and all the usual things journalists do, and he flatly refused. And he said, because, well, look, those guys, separatists or whatever you want, they came in here. And then the Ukrainians came back, and then the Ukrainian Secret Service got to work hunting down suspected collaborators, and that wasn't very pleasant. And now I can hear the Russian guns again. So, one person could be in power here today, one person could be in power tomorrow, and I have no intention of compromising my own security by, putting out in public. I don't know who's going to be knocking on my door next. And that underlines, I think that belies a bit of the official kind of confidence you were getting from the Ukrainians at one level. A lot of people around here are a lot less confident that the battle is going to go Ukraine's way.
Thanks, Roland. I have one final question to you before we move on to hearing from Danielle Sheridan, another one of our brilliant journalists who's been out in Ukraine. So as someone who's now reporting on the ground and moving, are you still in Donetsk? Are you still focusing on the Donetsk region, or where's the next place to look for you, if that makes sense?
Okay, we're currently in a place called Druzhkivka, which is near Slavyansk. It's in Donbass, in the Donetsk region. I think we're going to hang around here for a while. This is in that salient. So there's this huge salient about 50 miles across at its mouth, where the Russians are trying to push into Ukrainian lines, and the Ukrainians are trying to hold them back. It's pretty active, as Dom was saying. Small tactical gains at the moment, but anywhere you are, listen, you can hear the guns. The artillery is incessant. It rolls, and the fights, although the progress is not making much. They're not making much progress. The artillery duels are obviously very, very heavy. So we'll be reporting around here for a little bit.
Thank you so much, Roland. I now want to pass over to Danielle Sheridan, our defence correspondent, who's also been out in Ukraine. She's now back in London. Danny witnessed firsthand the atrocities in Ukraine, especially in the town of Bucha. But today she's on the front page of our features pullout for a different reason, bringing us a bit of light amid the darkness. Danny, can you tell us the story about your new pet?
Hello, yes. Her name is Danielle Sheridan, but we're going to call her Andy for short. Andriivka is a village in Ukraine that was completely decimated by Russian shelling and artillery, and was occupied for nearly a month in March. And basically, I was there with my photographer and our translator, and we were just wandering around the rubble one day, and this little doggy started clambering around Paul's legs, and he called me over, as he knows how much I love dogs, and she was just the most beautiful thing I've seen. And I picked her up, and she just nuzzled her head into my neck, and it was kind of just love at first sight. The thing about Ukraine is that because so many people fled or were killed, there is an abundance of pets roaming the streets. And these aren't your typical stray dogs. These are domesticated animals that are very much used to being cared for and being shown affection, and they've been completely deprived of this. So if you walk down the street, you are followed by dogs, even cats actually, just vying for your attention. And it was basically, that was the situation with Andy. So after we found her, we didn't really know what to do, because I just felt like I couldn't put her down. I didn't want to. And we went and found a resident on the street that our translator spoke to, and we asked him what the situation was with this dog. And he explained that she'd turned up on day one of the invasion, didn't have a collar, had absolutely no idea where she'd come from. And he'd been feeding her, but he said he has 3 other dogs he'd been feeding, and was really struggling to look after her. And he mentioned she's quite a small dog. We don't know what breed she is or how old she is. The vets think she's half Chihuahua, half Pomeranian, and suspected she was about 1.5. But this guy, Vladimir, was saying that the bigger dogs were picking on her, and he was struggling to care for her, and all the dogs were living rough. And said when I explained my intention of bringing her back home with me, he was overwhelmed by the idea and said that if I can do that, then I should. And therein began a very difficult process of finding a place for her to live back in Kyiv, which we succeeded in, getting her vaccinated against rabies, making sure she had a place to stay in country so that she could have a blood test 30 days later to prove the rabies vaccination had worked, get her microchipped. All sorts of things had to be done in order to show she was in good health to come back to the UK. But we did it all, and it was definitely worth it. And I ended up having to drive to Germany to collect her, because the woman that was taking care of her had to flee Kyiv in the end, because she just, everything had just been terrible for her and her daughter, and their home that they had originally been living in Irpin was bombed. So that's why she'd moved to Kyiv. And then once in Kyiv, there was a missile strike sometime after I'd left, and she was just too scared to keep living in the capital. So she is now in Germany, and she took Andy with her, and that's where myself and Paul Grover, the photographer, drove to in order to get her, and then came home via Calais. So it's been a very long-winded process, but absolutely worth it. And it's funny because I was looking at some of the comments on the online article of Andy's story basically today, and someone wrote something about, was this me projecting? And that it's really common that people in war zones do this. They attach a lot of emotion onto animals as a way of maybe processing what they're seeing and feeling, and perhaps that is the case, I don't know. But I certainly know that I was always a dog person, but I definitely felt an attachment to her in ways I haven't really before. So maybe I did feel extra emotional because of the circumstances. I remember my mum texted me when I told her what I'd done, 'cause we first brought her back to the hotel before finding a volunteer to look after her. My mum said, "Oh, this is so unrealistic. What are you doing?" And I just replied saying, "War isn't realistic. She's coming." So, and plus I'd already given her hope by bringing her out from the outdoors into my hotel, so I couldn't put her back on the street then. I'd well and truly committed. But yeah, it's I'm really, really happy with what I've done, because she's just so lovely and she has such a nice temperament, and who knows what her story was before our paths crossed. She was obviously someone's pet, and I don't know what happened to her owners, but she'd been living rough for the best part of 2 months, so it's really nice to have kind of been able to bring her to the UK and provide her with a nice, stable life. And she's currently with my parents right now on the Isle of Wight and is pretty much living her best life. She loves going to the beach for her walkies. So, yeah, it's a happy story to come out of a really devastating period in history, for me anyway.
Thanks, Danny. And I also wondered, you mentioned how many pets there were in Ukraine. Now, we've seen a lot of photos of cats being taken over borders and dogs in backpacks. Do you get the sense that Ukrainians have this kind of special relationship with animals, almost like we do in the UK?
People did say that. They said, you know what, if you ever see a stray dog, they're never going to be skinny because people will feed them. That is true. I didn't see any mangy dogs. They all did look quite well fed. So I think that people do have an affiliation towards pets, just like we do. But that's probably not dissimilar around the world. But a number did make comments about how people won't let animals go hungry, even in the midst of war. People are still, making sure that even if it deprives them, they're handing out food to animals that are either stray or have lost their owners. So it is a very warming thing to see.
And I have one final question, Danny, which is how Andy is adapting to life in the UK. Do you find that she's kind of scared of loud noises or the time in Ukraine? Can you see how it's affected her, I guess is my question.
So when she was staying in Kyiv with this volunteer called Irina, who was looking after her for me, there was a missile strike 350 metres from the apartment block they were in, and Irina texted to explain that she was squealing and shaking, and she sent me a video of her and she wouldn't come out of this cupboard. She was so scared. So that was really sad to see. But funnily enough, there's been some thunderstorms and she's been okay with that. So I don't think it's necessarily a case of loud noises are going to set her off. Perhaps she's able to tell the distinction between weather and a missile. But I mean, she's just very friendly and loving. So she's not yappy at all. She just really likes attention from humans. So it's hard to. It doesn't appear to have affected her negatively, and she really is loving being around the family. Every time I've been separated from her for 4 days now because my parents wanted to take her to the Isle of Wight on holiday, as I said, and she just wants to sit on their laps all the time. So maybe she's extra clingy because of she had been so deprived of the attention, but that's no bad thing. And I also forgot, I wanted to mention this really pivotal part of the story, which is that Irina, the volunteer who was looking after Andy, doesn't speak English. And I don't speak Ukrainian, but my sister in Windsor has a neighbour who is Ukrainian. She's from Odessa. So Lena, who I've never even met before, is now in a WhatsApp group with myself and Irina speaks in Ukrainian and I respond in English, and Lena has been so selflessly translating everything between us in order to get Andy home. So it really has been an operation that has involved so many people to get to this stage. But it's amazing. It takes a village.
It really does, and I know that Roland has said before, and as well as other members of our team who've been out in Ukraine, the importance of your translators in supporting you whilst you're out there, as well as people helping out when you're back. I'm going to change the tone slightly here. We've got a question from a listener, and we usually love getting your questions. So do reply to our tweets and DM me on Twitter and DM Dom on Twitter with your questions, because we do like to answer them. This one is probably for Dom Nicholls. So it's a question from Steve, and he asks, what is a cruise missile and do Ukraine have any? He then follows up by asking what weapons Ukraine could get from the Western allies with a longer range than the M777 howitzers to disrupt Russia's supply lines. Now, I would really like, also on top of that, a description of exactly what a M777 howitzer is, Dom, if that is possible.
Sure, I'll give it a go. I'm much more confident on this ground than I am about pet passports and what have you. I think it's amazing you managed to get up past Priti Patel, to be perfectly honest, without sending it to Rwanda. But anyway, so onto the weapons. So cruise missiles, basically think of a cruise missile as a small pilotless plane with a massive bomb at the front. So unlike traditional ballistic missiles, which they have a boost phase, they're sort of blasted out of the ground or out of the tube that they fire from, or come off an aircraft, submarine, what have you. But they have a boost phase, and then they essentially glide, and it's physics where they land. So the parabolic curve, when they go up under power, and then gravity will take them to wherever the target they're aimed at is. And that's why anti-ballistic missile radar, such as we have in the UK up in Fylingdales in North Yorkshire, and there's sites all over the world, they're able to track these things when they're in space and work out where the curve is, so they can work out firstly where it's going to hit, and secondly where it's come from. So those are ballistic missiles. Cruise missiles, which were designed to be able to defeat those types of systems, the systems that could defeat ballistic missiles because you know where they're going. That's not great if you want to get your missiles onto target. So cruise missiles came around towards the end of the 20th century. They were really showcased in the first Gulf War. That's the first time we really saw it. But the technology had been around for longer than that. But it was Gulf One where we really saw it for the first time. And they're cleverer missiles because they can hug the earth. And they don't have to use just physics, so they've got their own engine. They fly like a plane, and the reason that they can hug the earth is because they can tell where they are. They've got inertial guidance in them, so that can tell. It knows where it was launched from, and it knows where it needs to get to, and it knows how fast the earth is spinning and all that kind of good stuff. And then it can work out the acceleration that it's under and the speed it's going, and it can do all these clever calculations, work out time and distance, to be able to steer it to the target. That was the kind of very early models. And then the later models, more modern cruise missiles, have terrain contour matching, which have basically got 3D models of the world in the computer in the cruise missile, and then it's able to fire a radar. It has its own internal radar, and it sort of pings the radar against the ground, and it can match the radar return that it gets against this 3D model that it has in its computer, and it can, again, to work out where it is and where it needs to fly to hit the target. They rely very heavily these days on global positioning system, the satellites up in space, the network GPS satellites, to tell them where they are. And the most modern missiles these days have what's called digital scene matching, which is essentially a camera on the missile, so it knows what it's looking for, a bit like the terrain contour matching, but just sort of in with digital technology. So it's got an actual picture of what it's aiming at, and so it can not only go where it needs to go, but then be much more accurate about literally which part of that building it seeks to attack, or the target it's been aimed at. So cruise missiles are very, very clever, and were designed, as I say, think of them as pilotless planes. Now, they are fairly widespread around the world. Like I say, showcased first in the early 90s in Gulf One, but the US have a load. They have sort of missiles that are fired from or dropped from B-52 bombers. They've also got Tomahawk submarine launched missiles and the delightfully named JASSM, the Joint Air Surface Standoff Missile. That's air launched. Russia have a huge number, very similar to America, but they've also got ground launchers as well. So vehicles, big wheeled vehicles that can evade being destroyed by moving. Very simple, but it works. In the UK, we have Tomahawk submarine launched cruise missiles and Storm Shadow fired from Typhoon, and many countries in Europe have it as well. Also across the world, in Asia, Australia. So cruise missiles are no longer just the exotic missiles that they might have been in the early 90s. Now, Ukraine doesn't have any/many. We think that the Neptune missiles that sunk the Moskva a few weeks ago would qualify as cruise missiles, as in they weren't just dumb bombs. They weren't just fired and then were relying on the oomph that they were able to get and then gravity to take it where it needs to go. So we think the Neptune missiles we think that they fired Neptune missiles and they would be cruise missiles. But we don't think Ukraine has many of these in its inventory. We're not sure. We don't think that they are being gifted by the West. They are pretty complex. I mean, I say the missile itself is very clever, but as I've said many times on this pod, the actual munition is just one part. You've got to target it correctly. You've got to have all the wider communications infrastructure. If you're talking about satellites, you've clearly got to have that link. So there's a lot more to it than just the munition itself, which might be one reason why Ukraine doesn't have many cruise missiles. So what they are getting, they're getting heavy artillery. So these M777 howitzers, big American howitzers, 155 millimeter. Of course, 155. When we talk about the caliber, 155 millimeter, that's the diameter, the base of the shell. So the actual shell itself is about 2.5 feet tall. It's a big artillery shell, 155 millimeters wide at the base. So these are big old rounds. And whilst they are largely determined by physics, they are ballistically led. They can do some very clever things in order to do some other targetry, which we'd need to get a proper a gunner in here to talk about all that. But let's not get a gunner in here because he'll just bore the pants off us for hours. But let's just stick with the M777 being a 155 shell. These can go 30 or 40 Ks. The battles we've seen in the Donbass and up around Kharkiv has been to push the Russian artillery back so that they can't have that hugely debilitating effect of just smashing into civilian infrastructure and grinding the population down. So the effort has been to push that artillery back, which these big howitzers, these heavy howitzers, 155 mil, we talk about heavy and light. So a light gun, for example, would be about 105 mil. Still a big punch, but 155 can go further and create a lot more destruction when it gets there, and are a lot more accurate. The sighting systems are a lot more accurate. So they are a great addition. The drawback with the 777 is that they are towed. So they are towed by trucks, and then they're bedded into the ground. And these days, if you are not moving within a very short space of time, single digit minutes in most scenarios, you could expect to have counter battery fire arrive at your location. So M777s are very, very good, but they are vulnerable because they are largely static weapons. Now, what else has Ukraine got and getting? Well, in recent years, and I want to say recent years, I mean, we're talking the last couple of years, really, we've seen the arrival of what's called loitering munitions. So these are drones. Most people are sort of fairly aware of drones nowadays. Autonomous air vehicles that can go and fly, mostly line of sight with a radio link back to the controller, but some of them are beyond line of sight, as in either a satellite link or other clever comms to communicate to the aircraft. And these up to now have been sort of eyes in the sky, or the very big ones, the sort of Reaper, Predator, those types of things. They were armed. We saw those in conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. But in the last couple of years, we've seen very small air vehicles of maybe just a couple of meters long, which have cameras and also have weapons on them themselves, or indeed are themselves a weapon. So a loitering munition, if you fire something like the Phoenix Ghost that is seemingly going out to Ukraine, or the Switchblade 600, again from America, these munitions they have an explosive in the actual aircraft, so they can fly out. They have, different aircraft have different times, but if let's say they have a sort of 40-minute loiter time, which is pretty reasonable, that's kind of a good squad average there. And if they're going at about 100 Ks, you can imagine they've got a range of about 40 miles there. Now, the ideal thing is to put these loitering munitions out to work in a racetrack, if you like, so looking for a target rather than just go to one place and come back, or it might not have the legs, won't have the fuel to come back. So when we say it's got a range of 40 or 50 Ks, you'd probably use it a lot closer to your position than that. So it's got more time to hunt for a target. But because it's got a camera on it and because it is itself a weapon, it means that the controller can pick out, not only accurately pick out a target, but can go for the most important target. So if there's 3 tanks on one air defense system, you might find that you want to go for the air defense system. So you can then fly your helicopters out there to go and do a mission or to go and destroy the tanks or what have you. So the ability now to match eyes in the sky with a weapon in real time and able to loiter, so not back to the ballistic missiles of just pop it in the air and let physics do the rest. I mean, this is the modern way of warfare. Ranges, as I say, out to 30, 40 Ks, but probably slightly shorter than that. So you've got that loitering time. That's kind of where we are at the moment. That is the stuff that's being pushed out to Ukraine. That works in concert with these heavy howitzers, like the 155mm howitzers, and also self-propelled howitzers, which is the similar gun, but on a tracked chassis, on a tank chassis, basically, so it can move around on very broken ground. So the two combined, these howitzers and these loitering munitions with eyes in the sky, in giving information in real time back to a controller, is the modern way of warfare. We're seeing it in this campaign, in this war, more than any other of recent years, and it's really showing what the future is, basically, in many ways. By no means a panacea. They are fallible in many ways, which we probably haven't got time to go into now, but they are very capable and work very well as part of a combined arms effort. So when you match them with tanks and infantry on the ground and engineers and all the rest of it, knit it all together, as Ukraine seem to be able to do, and Ukraine seem to be able to do, and Russia seemingly cannot, then it can have we can see the effect. A much smaller force from Ukraine holding back, and in some cases pushing back, a much larger Russian force. I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, please come back. Very happy to explore in more detail. But thanks for the question, and I hope that answers it.
Thank you so much, Don. I'm sure that extremely thorough answer did answer Steve's question, and thank you, Steve, as well. Now, just finally, before we go, I know we're slightly pushed for time, but I'd really love to hear the final thoughts of both Roland and Danny, as reporters who have been out in Ukraine, and Roland, you're still out there. What would you suggest that our listeners keep an eye on over the coming days? And also, I guess, for you, Roland, is there any battles that you think are going to be kind of top priority over the coming days?
I think the Battle of Donbass remains the kind of top priority. This is Russia's big effort. There is a huge amount of ordnance being let off around here. The Ukrainian soldiers I speak to seem fairly confident. On the other hand, they are making progress. It's slow, but they are making progress. And throughout the summer, it's now dry, right? The tanks are theoretically able to get out in the fields. That's a whole other question, which I can talk to about Don one day about why they're not. But it's the summer fighting season. The outcome of the Donbass battle goes one of either two ways. Either we get into a stalemate, which a lot of Western analysts are predicting, which could last for years, or there's this other idea, maybe too optimistic, but being voiced by some Ukrainians, that, we put in a counteroffensive around Kharkiv. The Russians are running out of steam, and it's going to be our tanks taking advantage of this lovely dry ground, and we're going to push them back. Which way it goes, I don't know, but that is what I would be keeping an eye on.
As for myself, I think I'm just in awe of Roland's reporting. I have followed it closely since 2014, and I just advise all readers to keep reading his dispatches. They're absolutely brilliant, they're heartfelt, and I think we've just got some amazing correspondents at the Telegraph. So that's my advice, keep reading the Telegraph. Ukraine, the Latest, is an original podcast from the Telegraph.
To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at thetelegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as this helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Alice Hearing.